Okay, next on the list is the function Inarray, in_array, and it checks if a value exists in array, and it returns boolean true or false depending on whether the value has been found. Now we have the first argument, which is the needle, basically the item we're looking for, and then the second argument is of the array type, and it's basically called a haystack. In other words, it's an array in which we are searching for this first argument value. And then we have the third optional argument, which is boolean true or false. It basically tells us whether we are using the strict mode. And let's quickly have a look at the description here. Searches haystack for a needle using loose comparison unless strict is set, basically. What does it mean? Loose comparison is basically checks for whether the needle is found in a haystack based on the just equal symbol, double equal symbol, rather than identical, so it doesn't check for the data type. Unless, of course, the third argument is set to true, in which case it will check comparing for identity using the triple equal symbol. And then we have parameters needle, obviously, which we've already explained, the searched value. If needle is a string, the comparison is done in a case-sensitive manner, so uppercase or lowercase, that needs too much. Then we have a haystack, which is the array, and obviously strict. If the third parameter strict is set to true, then the Inarray function will also check the types of the needle in a haystack and returns value true if needle is found, in the array false otherwise. So let's quickly go to the editor and have a look at a few examples. We are going to start with a simple array, and I'm going to use square brackets, but again, just to remind you, you can also use this syntax. Square brackets, again, are available as of version 5.4 in PHP. Okay, so I'm going to put banana, for instance, we put the fruits here. Then we have apple, and then we have peach. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is check if in_array, and I'm looking for banana, and we pass in the array as the second argument to this function. Then I'm going to echo banana is in array. Else I'm going to echo there is no banana in array. So if we save it now, preview it in the browser, we refresh the page, banana is in array. Fantastic. Now let's try and check for a lowercase banana with the lower first letter. If we refresh the page, and it tells us there is no banana in array, as it's set. If the needle is a string, it will check as well for the case of the letters. So let's check for banana, but now let's try with a number. I'm going to try the first item in the array will be number 1 as a string between a single quotes. And now I'm going to check for an integer. I'm going to check if the integer is in this array. If we save it, preview it in the browser, refresh, and it tells me banana is in the array. Obviously, that's not quite the answer I was looking for, because we're looking for 1, but it's basically triggering this one. I'm going to say 1 as integer is in array. If we go back to the browser, yes, it is there. However, we are checking for equality, so it only checks if the value is equal what's inside of the array. But if we check for identity, in which case we are passing the true as the third argument to this function, and now it will check if the value is identical. In other words, if it also has the same data type, in which case we should see this, there is no 1 as integer, because obviously 1 as string is not the same as 1 as integer. So if we save it, preview it in the browser, and there we go. There is no 1 as integer in array. Next function is array key exists. So array key exists in the search field on the php.net. And what it does, it checks if the given key or index exists in the array. It returns boolean true or false. The first key, the first argument is the key, which can also be treated as a needle from the previous function, and then the second one of the array type is simply the array, which could be represented by the haystack. And then we have the array key exists returns true if the given key is set in the array. Key can be any value possible for an array index. And then we have parameters, obviously key, value to check, and then we have the array with keys to check. And then we have obviously the fact that it returns true or false, and a few examples. The first one is a very simple one basically. So we have the array with 2 items, then we check if array key exists, checking for the first string, which obviously is inside of the array, and then this echo statement is triggered once this has evaluated to true. Then we have example 2, and this is one I want to draw your attention to. Is set, which we also have covered not that long ago, does not return true for array keys that correspond to a null value. So if there's an example here, we have the first item with the index first and it has null associated with it. So isSet function would return false for this specific one, but array key exists will return true. In other words, if we have null value associated with any index, isSet will basically return false, while array key exists will return true. So this is the main difference between the two functions. And obviously, again, we have another example here, which does exactly this and tells you that returns false when we're calling this specific index on isSet, and array key exists returns true for the same one. Okay, let's go to the editor and do a few exercises. We are going to start with a function called return index of array, and then we have array as the first argument, the array type, and let's call it array as well. By default, it's going to be an empty array, and then we have index, and we want this this specific argument to be mandatory. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is simply return array, and we pass the index to indicate which item we want to return from this array. Now, probably name of the function return index of array, perhaps we should call it return value of array by index, probably a little bit better name. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is create the array. So numbers, and we start with semicolon at the end. We start with 0, and it's going to be represented by the 0 string. Then we have 1, 1, then we have 3, 3, and 4. It's going to be 4. Okay, now what I'm going to do is echo, and we use this return value of array by index, and we're passing our numbers array. But first thing I wanted to show you is, obviously we know that if we don't pass, we're going to get some error here, but I want to show you how many errors we are going to get if we don't pass this second mandatory argument to this function. If we save it, preview it in our browser, refresh the page, and there we go. First, we've got a warning saying missing argument 2 for return value of array by index function. So that's the first one. Basically, this function has triggered it, tells us you've missed the argument. It's mandatory and you haven't provided it. Then we have a notice saying undefined variable index on line 6. And then also on line 6, we have another one associated with this line, undefined index. So we have undefined variable and undefined index. And we go back to the editor. Undefined variable because we've used argument, which is basically represented by the variable. And then index because there is no index basically without any associated value inside of this numbers array, because there can't be. Now, so this is basically what we're going to get when we miss argument. We get 3 errors. But now, if I pass something outside of the array, index 5, for instance, as you can see, we haven't got index 5 here. So if we save it, preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and we're going to get undefined offset. So we're only going to get 1 error, obviously, again on the same line, because we are trying to get the value from this array by this index, which does not exist. And this is precisely where array key exists comes into play. We check would this array key exist. If this index exists, return it. Otherwise, we can obviously do something different, throw an error basically or anything like this. But before we go any further and we try and use this array key exists, I want to show you a few other examples. What is going to happen if, rather than any value, string or integer, float, or anything else, we are going to pass null to this function? Because null is technically null, so that you might think that when we pass null through as an argument, that's going to cause a problem as well, because that's like nothing's associated with it. But let's quickly have a look. We save it, refresh the page, and we get undefined index. We don't get undefined variable. We get undefined index. The first time when we didn't provide anything, the first problem we had was the undefined variable because there was nothing associated with it. But now there is a value associated with it because even though it's null, it's still some sort of value which we're passing through. So index. And now, can we actually have index null? Well, let's give it a try. Null equals, and let's say null. As you can see, my ID doesn't highlight anything, so that would indicate that null is going to be a valid key for the array. If we save it, preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and fair enough. There we go. So you can use null as an index of the array. Obviously, it's advisable not to, but if you ever have to, at least you know it works. Now, let's also try with Boolean false. And this is quite interesting. If we save it and preview it in the browser, and if we refresh the page, you can see we get 0. Now, why do we get 0? As you may remember, when you try and cast integer 0 to a Boolean value, then you will get false. The same happens with the Boolean when we try to convert it onto the integer. But when does this conversion happen? This conversion happens when we call in the array with a specific index. And if that index happen to be false, then that's what we're going to get. We're going to get integer 0. Let's try just numbers here without call to this function, and let's simply pass through false as an argument. Let's echo this in the browser so we can actually see the result. If we refresh the page again, we get the same result, as you can see, because this false has been casted to an integer 0. Okay, let's reverse all of this back. Now, another thing I wanted to show you is if we convert the index of this array, let's say this index 1 here, to a string, and we pass this as an argument as an integer type, if we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, we get 1. And this is because when you are calling index on the array using this approach, we obviously don't have to use the function. We can try again, just using this numbers array, and we pass it as an argument, an integer type, and we're comparing this against the index inside of the array. It uses the equality, not identity. So it will only check if the value is equal, the index in this case obviously is equal rather than identical. So it won't check the data type of the given index. So as you can see, it still returned 1 even though the index inside of the numbers array is a string. Okay, another thing I wanted to show you is what is going to happen. I'm going to remove this. What's going to happen if I have, let's say, item -1, because you can have negative indexes as well in the array, and I'll set it to null. Now with isSet, and I'm just going to use this var dump here. If we try isSet, and I'm going to try numbers with this -1 index, -1, and that should, if we preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, we have Boolean false. So isSet returned false. But now the function which we are now interested in is called array_keyExists. And if I try the same thing on this, obviously now we don't call it this way. We need to use separately the index as the first item of this function, so -1, and then we pass in the array as the second argument. And if we try this in the browser, refresh the page, we get true. So this is the main difference between the isSet and array_keyExists, that array_keyExists will return true even if the value is null. isSet, if it finds that the value of the associated index returns null, it will return false, basically. Okay, so let's remove all this, and let's now go back to our function. And what we're going to do is basically check if, and I'm going to check if array key does not exist using this exclamation mark before the call to this function. And again, I'm using spaces, you don't have to. I just like to have it clear what I'm doing with the function. And obviously in this case, I'm trying to achieve the opposite of this function does. So array_keyExists, and I'm passing the index and the array through. And now, because I'm only going to return one line, one statement when this evaluates to true, I am not going to use curly brackets. You can do it with the curly brackets like this, but I'm just going to create an indent and basically return whatever I want to do on the second line. So I'm going to use the die language construct, and I'm going to pass a message: index does not exist. Okay, if we save it and let's pass any index that doesn't exist on this array, let's say 5 again. If we go back to the browser, refresh the page, index does not exist. So as you can see, even if we put anything else after this call, after the call to this function, if I echo hello or here, yeah, whatever I'm going to put, basically it's not going to be shown in the browser, because once this die language construct has been called, nothing else is going to be executed. Basically, so that's how this die works, and we will cover die and exit, which are technically the same thing, a little bit later on. Okay, so we have the first check that we can obviously check that the array key exists, whether it exists in the array or not, and if it doesn't, it's going to throw this error here. Otherwise, it will simply return the index. So if we try and pass, let's say 3 here, and if we go back, refresh the page, we get 3 plus this here after obviously this call, because everything went fine. We didn't terminate the script. Let's just remove this. Okay, so that works fine. Now, what's going to happen if we now pass null to this function? So null will be passed to this array key exists. If we refresh the page, index does not exist. Again, it just basically checks if the index exists. So if we pass null and let's say null, that should still work fine, and there we go, we get the item. So null is absolutely fine. If we just remove it for now, and let's try and replace it with false, if that's going to work with this array key exists. If we pass it through, we get array key exists. The first argument should be either a string or an integer. And now, one thing for you to understand is these errors, these warnings, aren't always really accurate, because we know that null, which we can pass through as the first argument to this array key exists, is neither. It isn't a string and it's not an integer, but it still works. So obviously you have to always think of these as just some sort of information which will give you rough guiding, but it doesn't always give you the precise information that you should, basic information that would help you resolve the problem. Okay, so if we go back, what is happening here, basically the false inside of the array key exists is considered to not be a valid value. In which case, what we could do effectively is either make sure that we always type in the correct value, which probably would be the best thing to do. Or what we also could do is to check if, let's say, index equals is underscore string, and we pass in this index through, then we simply return it. So basically overwriting this index pass through as an argument with this new index here that we are actually overwriting. So we're checking this argument. If it's string, simply return it. So it's going to be associated with this new index. Otherwise, let's convert it to an integer. So we're going to typecast it, so int inside of the brackets, and we're making sure that the value will be converted to the integer. So that's how we do it. But now, obviously, using this approach, we will not be able to use null, because obviously null will be automatically converted to an integer because it's not a string. So let's try this with this false argument. If we refresh the page, and this has been automatically casted to an integer. Calling this directly, obviously false on the array, would be casted to an integer anyway. But when we're calling this, basically when we're using this index false on the array key exists, it needs to be casted to an integer. So false in this case was casted to an integer using this typecasting here, and obviously it's been converted to an integer 0. But obviously, if we now try and convert it to null, what we are going to find is that it's also converted to an integer. As I said earlier, null is probably not the best index anyway, so this should work just fine with this function, and we could basically finish this function this way and use it obviously the way it is now.